Everyone, this is Dave Farnsworth. Welcome to today's webinar, Flexible and Customizable, Designing Decoupling for Your State. In today's webinar, we're going to explore decoupling, including some of the decision points to be considered by regulators that are interested in decoupling. We'll also discuss how decoupling is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It can be tailored to your state's needs. Under traditional regulation, utilities make more money the more electricity they sell. Yet this equation can conflict with other public policy objectives. In response, some states have adopted or are considering adopting utility revenue regulation or decoupling to mitigate risks to utilities and consumers and to deal with potential revenue shortfalls caused by investment in distributed energy resources and energy efficiency. Drawing on RAP's recent report, Decoupling Design, Customizing Revenue Regulation to Your State's Priorities, our presenters will consider the decisions that regulators have to make when determining exactly what's covered under a decoupling instrument, how to adjust utility revenues, how to handle refunds or surcharges, and other customer and design-related issues. Let me introduce you to our presenters really briefly here. First, we have RAP Principal and U.S. Program Director Rich Sedano. Many of you know Rich, who advises state commissions and other decision makers on a range of topics, including energy efficiency, demand response, renewable energy, pricing, wholesale electric market issues. We also have RAP Principal Janine Migden-Ostrander, formerly the State of Ohio's Consumers Council, and 35 years of experience in public utility law. Janine advises regulators and advocates on a broad range of topics, including power sector transformation, energy efficiency, renewable energy, demand response, and consumer and low-income regulatory issues. Before we start the discussion today, let me explain how this webinar is going to work. Our speakers will provide about a half-hour presentation. They'll answer questions then until about 5 minutes to the hour and then wrap up with some final thoughts. At the top of the hour, we will end our 60-minute session, but if there's interest, Rich and Janine will stay on the line and take additional questions for another 30 minutes. We have about 300 registrants today for the webinar, so we're going to keep your phone lines muted, but if you have questions, as we go along, please type them in the questions pane on the right side of your screen. We'll pause in the middle of the presentation to address any clarifying questions that you have submitted. Other questions we're going to hold for the Q&A session after the presentation. Also note on the right-hand side of your screen the link that says Handout. Click that and you'll have access to the paper Decoupling Design, the one I just mentioned, upon which this webinar is based. Also, remember this presentation is being recorded. It's going to be posted on our website so you or others can access it at a later time. Finally, if you would please, this is just a reminder, take a couple minutes if you would and fill out the very, very brief survey we have at the end of the webinar. It really helps us being more responsive to your needs. I think that covers it. Rich, I'll hand this over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and welcome everybody to this webinar. The subject of decoupling has been a topic of interest to RAP for a long time because we are experts in regulation. We want regulation to work well, and as we have seen the development of customer resources, starting with energy efficiency, we've been concerned that traditional regulation has been non-aligned with developing priorities for regulation. So a few years ago, this was RAP's first report in recent years that discussed decoupling, a guide to theory and application, and discussed how decoupling works, what changes and what doesn't in regulation, and its theoretical underpinnings. And this was a bit of an encyclopedic effort to go cover all of the various issues related to decoupling, and this is just a brief list of the kinds of topics that you'll find in revenue regulation and decoupling, a guide to theory and application. We realized that this was a little bit high level and that we needed to perhaps ground our advice to states, and so we did a case studies report looking at the decoupling mechanisms in place in 6 different states. And it confirmed our conclusion that there are a lot of different ways to approach the design of decoupling. And you'll find in our reprint of Revenue Regulation and Decoupling, a Guide to Theory and Application, which we've just issued, we've actually combined these 2 papers into one document. But we still had the feeling that people who were thinking about decoupling weren't quite sure how to get started. And so we recently produced this 3rd paper in this recent cycle called Decoupling Design, Customizing Revenue Regulation to Your State's Priorities. And we lay out some of the important choices states and utilities make when implementing decoupling, and that will be the focus of our discussion today. Let's step back to discuss a couple of basics for a few moments to recall that when discussing decoupling, we are discussing an answer to a question, and that question is whether the throughput incentive, an important attribute of traditional regulation, is a problem. Some might think it's not a problem, but if there is a condition where energy efficiency is part of the utility's job and where customer resources are emergent in different ways and in a growing scale, basing utility revenues on and earnings on throughput creates a conflict. One of my pet peeves held over from my time in government, I worked in government in Vermont for many years, is utility executives hoping for hot summers and cold winters for the positive effects that those conditions will have on their sales and profits. Hot summers and cold winters are not good news for customers, so why should they be good news for utilities? So we have this potential misalignment of interests, and perhaps there's an answer to that question about whether that can be fixed. We also note that there is some revenue volatility in traditional regulation that perhaps could also be fixed. So our task then is to consider ways to motivate utilities through regulation in alignment with public policy goals and to diminish the conflict as much as we can. And isn't that an indication of good government to send out the right kinds of signals to help regulated companies serve their public better? Now, if you're wondering how significant this misalignment can be, we've produced this table, which is in the report, from an actual utility that shows the effect of relatively modest changes in sales and revenues and how that's magnified when one considers earnings. Why does this happen? Well, in the short run, embedded costs are what they are and must be covered, and rates are set to provide revenues to cover them. When revenue diverges, either positive, where the red circle is, or negative, there can be a shortfall or an excess, and that produces a multiplied effect on earnings for the utility. So you can see why the utility would like to increase sales where it can and avoid reducing sales. And this is how the throughput incentive works and why it can be a disruptor to good policy. So decoupling reconciles rates to recover the revenue determined to be just and reasonable in some prior proceeding. Now, not needing to change the retail rate is based on a volumetric rate design. If the utility has already adopted a straight fixed variable rate design, which has other problems, then consumer advocates should argue to substitute decoupling for straight fixed variable. The regulator can use the flexibility in decoupling to make important rate design choices going forward, and decoupling doesn't affect those rate design choices at all. In other words, states should have the rate design they want. Rate design shouldn't or doesn't need to be used for revenue adequacy concerns. The following few images remind us about the source of the revenue requirement and where rates come from. So it is the revenue requirement that the rate case focuses on, and it adds up these several cost centers: test year expenses, depreciation, taxes, and the return on rate base. And the revenue requirement is recovered from customers through these different rate elements. And so the revenue requirement is what the rate case focuses on, and the price per energy unit falls out of the revenue requirement and the billing determinants, and is very often covering some significant amount of embedded fixed costs. So to help our community see the design choices to align utility behavior with public policy through decoupling, we created this report. And in this presentation, we will use some images from the report, so when you download it and look at it, you will recognize the graphics you see here today. A key point we want to leave you with is that there's a host of design elements involved in developing a decoupling mechanism. This provides states with the flexibility to create a decoupling mechanism that meets the needs and goals of its stakeholders. Our report has 3 design sections: deciding what's covered, how to adjust utility revenue, and how to handle refunds and surcharges. And we add a section on customer consideration, starts with a list that any state can add to. So starting with considering what decoupling mechanisms should cover, we see 3 subcategories that I'll discuss in turn. Utility function is really about whether to just focus on the wires or delivery part of the business, or whether to include generation too. Our advice tends to focus decoupling on embedded costs. Variable costs are volatile and harder for the decoupling mechanism to manage in a satisfying way. You can capture variable costs in riders, so while states can do it either way and have, we find that more success comes from focusing on wires, but either way is possible. The issue of whether to include power supply costs only comes up in vertically integrated states, because in retail competition states you only have wires companies. Another choice is about which customers are covered. All customers is a good answer if you use a utility-wide reconciliation of prices, and that can work. But in many states, customer advocates for specific classes may prefer to be treated distinctly and may advocate for that. So where that is the case, where customer classes are treated distinctly in the decoupling mechanism, a class with a small number of customers, a small number of members, such as the industrial class can be, suggests that a state might want to exclude the industrial class from the decoupling mechanism, since the actions of a single customer may have too much of an effect on the others. You can imagine what would happen if a major industrial manufacturer added a 3rd shift or reduced a 3rd shift. A significant change in sales might ensue, and if there aren't that many other industrial customers, that might have a significant effect on the others, and that's a good reason to exclude them. Sometimes also large customers value their own rate stability in a globally competitive environment, and that can be a factor in the underlying politics of this choice. Most states have riders. Should they be included in the decoupling mechanism? If a decoupling mechanism includes riders, and there is a danger that the mechanism will adjust revenues in a way that will either frustrate or magnify the purpose of the tracker, we tend to recommend that decoupling apply to the body of costs not covered by trackers. But in any case, we have some advice about watching out for double recovery. In other words, adjusting revenues within the decoupling mechanism that are already being adjusted in the trackers. Looking a little deeper, we'll define the revenue per customer, RPC, later, but for a utility that owns generation and thus has embedded and depreciating fixed costs and variable costs, there could be a mismatch between customer growth and generation cost declines, that could lead to a misdesigned decoupling mechanism and yielding excessive revenues for the utility. So as a starting point, we tend to advise for decoupling that all generating costs be passed through the power cost rider, and that's another reason why we tend to recommend that decoupling focus on the wires or delivery side of the business. So here's a reminder of using a representation of the major cost categories from the revenue requirement. Base rates for power generation in the top line, base rates for delivery and in the second line, and the fuel costs. And of course, in the retail competition state, you'll only have the base rates for delivery. And as I said earlier, we tend to advise focusing decoupling on delivery costs, but the state can choose to include generation with the proper adaptations. So the second major category that we discuss is how to adjust utility revenue. And remember, the essence of decoupling is to adjust rates to recover revenue found to be just and reasonable in some prior case, and to leave the utility indifferent to the volume of sales. And as before, we have three subcategories to show you. First is about the form of the adjustment. The assumptions in a decoupling mechanism may be seen to having a shelf life. We can be confident in the assumptions for maybe a period of time, but at some point events happen and the assumptions lose their power. Despite that, a state can choose to let a decoupling mechanism run until there is a rate case whenever that occurs, and that does happen. But in many cases, states develop a comfort level about the information they use and for how long the information is valid. And an important adaptation for this, in some states we just see a requirement to relook at the revenue requirement within a period of time of usually 3 to 5 years, but some states consider that it's okay to have a mini rate case from time to time to look at major cost categories and to adjust those cost categories and the revenue requirement associated with them. This is not a full rate case, and states that have statutes about selective updating would find this difficult to do, but for states that allow this, it can allow the underlying costs that might be changing to get factored in a way that's still not too burdensome from an administrative perspective, and ultimately get revenue recovery on target. The question of capital structure comes up with decoupling because of the risk of the firm associated with revenue recovery appears to decrease. This issue gets emotional sometimes because the return on equity is such an easy number to focus on and is very important to some people. If decoupling does reduce the risk to the firm, it will do that if markets have confidence that decoupling will endure, and markets will factor it into the data you use in calculations of ROE. An ex ante or before the fact adjustment to decoupling is essentially a down payment on the change in this risk that you're assuming, and some would say that there's no evidence, and some would say, well, it's likely to happen. So that's a discussion that sometimes happens. If a state wants to see an ex ante or a down payment on the risk reduction from decoupling, it doesn't have to accomplish this with reduced return on equity. Decoupling may allow the utility to increase its debt ratio and reduce equity for which a higher return is required while maintaining its credit rating. In this example, the adjusted capital structure produces a reduction in revenue requirement of $3.25 million. We're going to stop for a moment to see if there are clarifying questions that have come in. Dave?
You know, Rich, there are no clarifying questions that have been submitted, so I think we can just pass this off to Janine.
Okay, thank you very much. we're going to pick up with the next area, which is how to adjust, how to adjust the, how to adjust the revenue. So there are a number of different mechanisms that you can choose, and the revenue adjustment mechanism is probably the most significant aspect of your decoupling decisions and the most critical one. And there are a number of different revenue adjustment mechanisms that we go into in a fair amount of detail in the report. But to go over them briefly, the first is no revenue adjustment mechanism. And in that instance, rates are not adjusted until the next rate case. Under a stair-step approach, these are predetermined adjustments that are made in the last rate case based on projections or forecasts of projected cost increases. So that's an important point to remember, that these are forecasted increases. And indexing would be adjustments to the revenue requirements that are tied to factors such as inflation, industry productivity, and customer growth. We also then have other mechanisms such as the revenue per customer, which is probably the most popular revenue adjustment mechanism. And on this one, the revenue requirements are determined on a per customer basis and is adjusted for the total number of customers served. And I will be showing you a slide on how that works further in. The annual decoupling mechanism, also known as an attrition adjustment or attrition decoupling. The rates are periodically adjusted for incremental and decremental known and measurable changes to the rate base and operating expenses. So this contrasts with the stair-step where it's forecasted. The annual attrition adjustment is based on known and measurable, but you would not, for example, include in that a known change of a power plant coming into operation or some really extraordinary large expense. But one thing to keep in mind is that the attrition adjustment can also allow for decremental changes. For example, as generating plant depreciates, you would reflect that diminishing rate base in your adjustment mechanism. The next factor that I want to talk about briefly is the K factor, which would reflect declining transmission and generation costs between rate cases. And it can be combined with the revenue per customer mechanism to allow better tracking of cost drivers that are changing. The hybrid is where you combine one or two of the revenue adjustment mechanisms, for example, combining the revenue per customer with the K factor or combining stair-stepping and indexing. So something to look at is, two of the most recommended approaches from our perspective are the revenue per customer and the attrition decoupling. So let's look at the type of utility. If you have a vertically integrated or a distribution only, obviously with a vertically integrated it could cover distribution costs and it may or may not cover power supply costs, whereas a distribution only utility, it'll only be the distribution costs. So for a vertically integrated company, we would recommend the attrition decoupling, especially if power supply costs are included in that, as a way of recognizing decremental changes in the rate base for depreciation, for example, or to try to avoid any kind of over-recovery. If it's a distribution only, you could go either way. You could do the revenue per customer or you could do the attrition adjustment. So I'm going to show you some quick calculations of how decoupling works, and this is pretty simple here. What we've done is we assume a target revenues of $10 million, test year sales of $100,000, and that divided test year sales into revenues, you get a price of 10 cents per kWh. Now let's take a look at, you've got a decoupling mechanism in place, and your actual sales, because of comprehensive energy efficiency and other things, has resulted in the actual sales being $99,500,000. And so to get the utility to that target revenue of $10 million, it would require a price adjustment, which would be a surcharge of 0.0005 cents per kWh. So it's a very small surcharge that would be added to the customer's bill. For a revenue per customer calculation, we have the same thing going on that we had in the previous slide, but only what we now do is we take a look at the number of customers, which is 200,000, and we divide and we come up with a revenue per customer calculation of $50. So let's say we've put the decoupling mechanism in place. It's using a revenue per customer, and at the end of the reconciliation period, when you're going to be making the adjustment, the customer count has risen to 200,500. But so what you would do is you would revise the target revenues to reflect the $50 per customer times the new customer count, and you would get $10,025,000. But let's say actual sales were only $99,750,000 due to, again, comprehensive energy efficiency. The price adjustment that would be needed to be made, again, would be in the neighborhood of 0.05 cents per kWh, a very small amount. So that's how you can distinguish how the two mechanisms work. And I think I misspoke. It's 0.005 cents per kWh. Okay, so going to the next area of our report, which was the third section on how do we handle refunds or surcharges. And there's a lot of variables involved in this. And as you can see by this list, which I will go through one by one. So the first is the surcharge. Should there be symmetry such that if the utility over-recovers, that there's a credit back to customers? And to me, this is a no-brainer, and that's what's fair and should be done. And quite frankly, as a consumer advocate, this is what really attracted me to decoupling. Because you go into a rate case, everybody argues about what the revenue requirements should be. The commission comes out with a decision, and that's what the revenue requirement is. And for the first time, customers have a means of making sure that the utilities don't over-recover. It's a way to make sure that they're not over-earning. You know, when you have a number of years between rate cases, sometimes it's because the utilities are doing very, very, very well, in fact, over and above what the commission authorized. By the same token, for the utilities, it provides a certain amount of certainty, which Wall Street really likes, to know that the utility is going to meet its revenue requirements. It reduces risk. So the symmetry is, and in decoupling, is a win-win for everybody. This chart here shows the changes, you know, what is the impact of decoupling? And while this chart is a little bit dated and could use some refreshing, we think that the results would be the same, pretty similar, if the chart had been updated. But what's interesting about this is that the majority of adjustments are in the plus or minus 1 to 2% range. So we're not talking about huge swings in rates for customers either way. How to handle surcharges or refunds is another issue. Should you allocate the over or under recovery across the board to all customers, or by customer class, or by rate element? By customer class, you might want to just determine what each customer class's contribution is, and then come up with a cents per kWh rate per customer class. The rate elements, I'll be getting into that later in the slide when we talk about some of the customer considerations. Choosing a rate adjustment mechanism, you could do that via a rider or via a rate case. If you have a decoupling mechanism where you're having many rate cases, a base rate may work. If there's a significant period of time in between rate cases, it may be that a rider will work better. But these are decision points. Frequency of true-ups is another issue. You could design a decoupling mechanism so that you're truing up every year, or that you're doing it every month like Baltimore Gas and Electric does. Those are two distinct options. A current methodology is more accurate and to the moment, but an accrual mechanism has the advantage of avoiding rate volatility from month to month and smoothing out the highs and lows for an annual number. Caps on the size of the decoupling adjustment is another issue. Consumer advocates are very often, regulators too, concerned about large swings or large increases as a result of the decoupling mechanism. Although the chart we showed you illustrates those are not as frequent. But nonetheless, you can protect customers from price swings by putting a cap on how much of a decoupling adjustment would be permitted, and the cap could be anywhere from 2 to 5%, depending upon what the regulators decide. And the cap could be on revenues, or it could be capped on rates. The more common mechanism is through rates. Carrying charges for deferrals, for decoupling deferrals. There's a number of ways you could do it. You could do a risk-free rate. You could do the weighted average cost of capital, or I've seen in a number of examples the customer deposit rate used. In either event, there should be symmetry so that if customers are paying carrying charges for surcharges that the utility is carrying, they should also get carrying charges for amounts that are refunded that they've made for the funds they've made available to the utility. So now I want to talk briefly about customer considerations, which was the fourth major component of our paper. And there are a number of different considerations that I'll go into here. So before we talked about the rate elements being one way of allocating surcharges and refunds. If you look at this example, which was something that Tucson Electric used many years ago, what you can do is where you have an inclining block rate structure, you apply any decoupling credit to the first block. That way all customers get the benefit of it. But then you apply the surcharges to the higher tiered usage blocks. And what that does is it sends an additional message or price signal for energy conservation. And it also protects low-income customers who tend to be the lower-use customers. Customer living in low-income customers unlikely to have as many electronic gadgets and as big a house to fill them with. So there is a correlation between customer usage and customer income, which could be reflected here. Other things to protect customers is symmetry, which we discussed earlier, stability in terms of having caps on rate changes to make sure that there aren't large fluctuations, changes to the capitalization ratio to reflect risk reductions that Rich spoke about earlier, and also bill simplification of having these charges and all the riders reflected in the blocks that for example, in this kind of a rate, as opposed to having individualized riders. When I was a consumer advocate in a public hearing, a customer stood up and said, "I've got 12 surcharges on my bill. How the heck do I figure this out?" So simplification helps customers. Other ideas to protect customers are things like directing more funds towards energy efficiency and having decoupling conditioned upon comprehensive energy efficiency programs. So that there is a benefit going back to customers. The reason you're giving the utilities the decoupling is because it's going to result in reduced revenues as consumption goes down, as Rich discussed more earlier. The other thing is to have money allocated to low-income programs, setting aside a certain percentage of an energy efficiency budget to focus on low-income and perhaps pairing those funds with funds that your state may elect to use for home weatherization assistance. This chart is, I'm not going to go over it, so don't worry. It's a pretty big chart here. But I direct your attention to looking at this closely in our paper. What this does is lists most of the major elements and then what the various options are. So what this is trying to illustrate is that clearly decoupling is not a one-size-fits-all, and when somebody says, this is my viewpoint on decoupling, you really have to dig deeper and say, okay, what is the decoupling design that you're looking at? Or if somebody has an issue with a specific design component, you may be able to look at this and say, well, if you did it this way, that would solve that concern. So we'd recommend that to you. So decoupling mechanisms, in terms of other points to make, is that decoupling addresses the throughput incentives. And there's also, at the same time, been a lot of rate design concerns about increasing the emphasis on price signals. And decoupling is the only mechanism that aligns both of those policies of addressing the throughput incentives and creating correct price signals. Straight fixed variable, which Rich mentioned briefly before, does not do it. Lost revenue adjustment mechanism does not do it. Also, consumer welfare can be protected and furthered in a decoupling mechanism. It is a mechanism to ensure against utility over-recovery and excessive earnings, which is very valuable to consumers. And it can be suited to support more innovative performance. This next slide shows you a number of different resources that RAP has on decoupling. And if you'll note on the bottom, our website, raponline.org, not only do we have a lot of resources on decoupling, but we have a lot of resources on all kinds of, on all sorts of issues involving energy regulation. So I would encourage you to explore our website. And with that, Dave, we're ready for questions.
Great, thank you, Janine. That was terrific. Thank you both. This is a question for either of you. What's the difference between attrition adjustments and formula rates or performance-based rate making? In other words, annual changes allowed based on changes in a small basket of variables.
So the question is about attrition. An attrition adjustment allows you to make changes for known and measurable changes on usually an annual basis, sometimes through a mini rate case to reflect changes that you know that are going to occur with operating expenses and rate base. Performance regulation is a different mechanism which will allows utilities to it sets up a set of metrics where you're measuring utility performance on a number of different areas and may permit a utility to earn a return or earn a return based on its performance, or to lose some of its return based upon how it's structured for failure to perform up to a certain cap of a return. And there was a third piece, Dave. I didn't quite get what the third piece was.
The third piece, performance-based rate making.
Okay, I just covered the performance-based attrition, and there was a third piece, I thought.
Oh, formula rates.
Formula rates where you know that you're going to have specific increases or decreases on it based upon a schedule have in some cases been thought to be able to be used to substitute for a decoupling mechanism because you're adjusting the rates every year based upon sales, based upon expenses, and a whole lot of other factors. So you may not need to layer on a decoupling mechanism on top of a formula rate if you go that direction.
Okay. How do you encourage a utility to decrease its ROE commensurate with the decreased risk that you've just described?
I think, there's a question about, well, first of all, no utility is going to willingly say, let's reduce my ROE. And I think that's a very controversial issue. Part of the certainty of having decoupling, part of the whole issue with decoupling is providing the certainty to Wall Street and shareholders that the utility is going to recover its revenue requirements. We think that the utilizing the capitalization ratio is a better way to go for that reason. If you reduce the return on equity, it could increase the cost of borrowing. Restructuring the capitalization ratio instead is a better way to provide benefits back to customers.
But Dave, I think one of the factors there is whether there's evidence as you're starting out with decoupling to know what the effect of decoupling is on the risk of the firm. One thing that sometimes happens is that a state says, well, we're going to try out decoupling, and they call it a pilot. And in those situations, markets may not have confidence that the state is really committed to decoupling, and so there may not necessarily be any actual market impacts from decoupling until the state determines that they're committed to it. For example, California and New York are states that are clearly committed to decoupling, Maryland. And so whatever risk adjustments have been factored into markets, and then the normal approach in a rate case of in some of the ways that we calculate ROE will actually reflect the market's views on that. And so what I'm getting to at the end of the day is that regulators should be attuned to this issue, but may not actually have to make an affirmative adjustment because the normal course of regulation may accomplish that for them.
Okay, thank you. What data is typically used by PUCs to build a stair-stepped attrition adjustment? Over what time period are these adjustments applied?
That can vary. For a stair-step, things like in terms of what period of time, how far out various commissions go, we haven't seen too many examples with them going out too far. It is a mechanism that is not as widely used as others. But when you have, for example, forecasted a future test year in a rate case, that might give you some insights on what some of the projected costs are. For example, you know that the labor contracts are going to expire and they're going to be renegotiated. You've heard from the post office they're going to increase their postage expense. You know, so various kinds of expenses that you can somewhat predict might be over a period of years, but you wouldn't want to go too far out because, as with any forecast, the further in the future you go, the more speculative it becomes.
Okay, thanks. If customer rates are continually changing, does this create uncertainty for them in payback periods for energy efficiency or other distributed resources?
I think the changes that you're talking about in rates are pretty minimal, so as to not have large impacts either on paybacks. Because if you go back to the slide that we had where we showed the examples of the kinds of adjustments we're talking about, they're pretty much within plus or minus 1%, so it's not going to have a really huge impact.
Okay, we'll get to that slide. Perhaps not. Thanks, Janine. Interested in the distinction, if any, between imposing a cap on rates or on bills. If one is going to establish a percentage cap on the decoupling adjustment, is there a difference between imposing that cap on rate or on bills?
Well, I think if you impose it on bills, it's a more accurate way to do it because when you, on rates, because when you do it on a bill can fluctuate as usage fluctuates. So you'd have to do some sort of a budget bill calculation and calculate from there how would you do the adjustment. And there are all sorts of unknown factors that influence how much a customer may use at a given time, whether they're on vacation, whether they're home, what the weather is like, just a lot of different factors. So I would recommend it be done on rates rather than on bills.
Thanks. Could you speak a bit more about the politics of these decisions? Do industrial customers, for example, prefer to be excluded from the decoupling mechanism? Does the stability that decoupling provides lead ratepayer advocates to promote reducing the rate of return allowed? Are any of these more or less justified objectively?
I think very often we've seen that industrial customers do want to be excluded, and there are some good reasons for it. Some of which, a lot of which Rich touched upon earlier, but also the industrial load is not homogeneous. It's very different. Within an industrial class, you may have different demand charges. You may have different sizes of usage. So trying to come up with a fair, accurate decoupling mechanism, some states have done it, but it becomes more challenging. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of industrial customers will oppose it, and some jurisdictions will say, okay, we're just going to apply decoupling to commercial and small residential because the objections of the industrial class for various reasons create too many barriers. Respect to consumer groups wanting to see reductions in the return on equity, again, I think that when you do that, it creates more instability from the standpoint of Wall Street, which could result in instability on the bond ratings, and it could result in a higher cost of borrowing, which then comes back and will burn consumers when utilities have to add new investments, and the cost of borrowing for those investments, which customers cover, is increased. So I think you have to look at it from a very holistic approach. And again, you know, we have talked about a capitalization adjustment, looking at the capitalization concerns.
I think we might have lost you, Janine.
Dave, I'll say something about the politics. You're back, Janine, but I wanted to say something about the politics. There is often a sense about the rates moving outside of a rate case that is uncomfortable for some customers and their representatives. And obviously, one of the ways to deal with that is to minimize those deviations. So we have the caps that Janine talked about. But I think at a more general level, we talk about communicating to customers about decoupling very often in a decoupling mechanism, which is done by very smart people who don't always take the time to figure out what the public messages need to be. I think one of the important messages that doesn't get used very often is that to the extent that it changes the culture of the utility to focus more on service and less on sales, and to the extent that it potentially changes the decision makings in the utility that in ways that might tend to keep long-run costs from occurring, then there is a lot of long-term benefits for customers. But if we find it difficult to figure out how to talk about those things, then any value from that might get lost in the conversation, and the irritation potentially of annual or periodic rate changes becomes the thing that is most dominant. I mean, decoupling is a pretty simple mechanism as we see it, especially in a place like Maryland, which actually adjusts rates monthly, and it seems to work fine. But in some places, the irritation of rate changes becomes the thing that people worry about, and political traction goes against decoupling in those situations, perhaps because the benefits are harder to articulate.
Thanks, Rich. So related to that, the point you made about the worries associated with rate changes happening outside of rate cases, can you think of other cons of decoupling?
Well, I'll go first and say that, of course, one of the cons of decoupling is, as this presentation is all about, you can do it well, but you can also do it badly. So it does require the designers of the decoupling mechanism, and it's often best to do decoupling in a somewhat collaborative way with utilities and stakeholders engaging with regulators to find the right balance of these choices. And so one way that decoupling can go wrong is if it's imposed on a utility that doesn't want it, and the balances can be messy there, or if utility makes a proposal without consulting with others, and it can be a very utility-centric approach without good customer features in it, or features that public policy people, perhaps in the legislature, would want to see. So there are ways to do it wrong, and I think that's the cons about it come from getting on the wrong track. I think done well, decoupling can really just perform a lot of really good things for a state. I guess one other thing to mention is that the assumptions do have a shelf life, and for those states that let decoupling run until the next rate case, whenever that is, do run some risk that the decoupling mechanism becomes unmoored from reality, and while that doesn't necessarily produce a bad result, it could, and so that's why we suggest resetting the revenue requirement from time to time in a state that's committed to decoupling. Even in the UK model of alternative regulation that they use, they have an 8-year cycle, which they examine to make sure they're on track every 4 years. So that's another indicator of somebody who's thought about this and come up with a plan to make sure that their assumptions are valid.
Thanks, Rich. Janine, anything to add to that?
Well, I think Rich did a very good job. Thank you.
Great. A question about unintended consequences of decoupling. For example, when utilities have a lackluster effort to restore power after outages, how to create the proper signal so utilities act with urgency even when revenues are not depending on it?
I think this is a bit of a misconception about decoupling, because the utility is getting its revenue requirements. And we talk about this a bit in the paper, and so I would turn your attention to this topic in the paper. Even if the utility is going to get a certain amount of revenue requirements, so they do have an incentive to continue to be efficient in their operations and do things correctly. The notion that they're all of a sudden going to decline in their performance could result in other penalties in other ways. So, and I think it's a question of regulators also being vigilant with regard to that.
Well, Dave, this is an unintended consequence that I didn't think of before, but does come up. One thing that decoupling is good at is motivating utilities to control their costs. If their revenue requirement has been set for a few years out into the future, one way that utilities can look at increasing their net earnings is to process re-engineer and to cut costs in a way that's constructive. They can also, though, cut costs in a way that are not helpful. And if they cut costs that negatively impact service or reliability, that's of course a bad thing. Which is why in some places some sort of performance systems are put in place along with decoupling to avoid the temptation that a utility executive team might have in order to use the decoupling mechanism as a way to increase profits by cutting costs in a way that it actually is detrimental to service. So in the example that you mentioned in your question, you could have a performance system on outage duration or frequency that would tend to hold utilities' feet to the fire on that kind of performance and cause them to not cut costs that would tend to make the territory more vulnerable to those kinds of situations.
Thanks, Rich. So we're getting near the top of the hour. I have time maybe for one more question. Can you discuss decoupling as a strategy for changing the incentives around large capital projects as a means for cultivating distributed energy generation?
Well, decoupling can be used as a mechanism to assure that the utilities get the revenue requirements that they need. So from that standpoint, if the utility is, if you address the throughput incentive, then the utility should be somewhat indifferent. Obviously, there's always an incentive for utilities to increase capital expenditures, but then that goes again to the issue that we were talking about earlier of tying decoupling with performance metrics so that what the utility is getting compensated for and what is of value to the utility changed the frame from something of being very concerned about capital investments to a utility being more concerned about performance as a means of obtaining its return.
And Dave, I'll just add a couple of things. First of all, if decoupling helps utilities accept and even promote, if there's proper incentives, distributed energy resources, then that will reduce the need for capital. But we have to also recognize that decoupling isn't a silver bullet. It's not a cure-all. It doesn't motivate distributed resources without complementary policies on performance to do that. And it doesn't address the bias towards capital and against operating expenses that might be less expensive. So regulators need to think, if they want reforms in utility behavior, regulators need to look at all of their tools, including, for example, something that the New York Commission calls its clawback mechanism, which allows for budgeted but unused capital expenses to get pulled back from the utility, and if the utility chooses to use operating expenses to replace capital, they can get favorable regulatory treatment for that. And I know several other states are looking at addressing that bias. So there are a number of tools that we need to look at to address these investment concerns, but decoupling can certainly be supportive to that strategy.
Great, thanks, Rich. So we're near the top of the hour. Janine, do you want to offer a few summary comments?
Sure. The decoupling, I want to give you a few key takeaways from our paper. Obviously, from this presentation, we hope we've left you with the message that decoupling is flexible, it's customizable, there are a lot of decision points, and there's the opportunity to design decoupling to make it work for your jurisdiction. It's been done before. Our study of 6 examples is one that you could look at to get some idea of how it's been done in some of the jurisdictions. But there are plenty of models out there that exist. We chose 6, but there's a whole lot more that you can choose from. And decoupling can help complement and serve the policy goals of most states. If you're encouraging energy efficiency, you're encouraging distributed energy resources, you want to send the appropriate price signals, but you want to protect the utilities' revenues, decoupling can work very well, and it can provide benefits back to consumers and protections to consumers through price caps, and very importantly, through symmetry in terms of over and under recovery, so that whatever the revenue requirements are, that's what the utility gets, nothing more and nothing less, and customers are not put in a situation where they are overpaying in rates for years and years between rate cases. So it creates a very good balance between the utility and the customer, and creates a win-win solution. And then the final thing I would say is that decoupling can be, as we talked about a little bit here, decoupling coupled with other things such as performance metrics or performance regulation may provide even more added benefits.
Great. Well, thank you, Janine. And Rich and Janine, thank you both for this terrific presentation. And thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned, we are going to formally end this webinar here at the top of the hour, but we have a lot of questions from you all, so we're willing to stay on for another half hour and to continue addressing those. So sit tight just for a sec. I think that was about a sec. Okay, so here we go. How can consumers be protected in a recession under decoupling to prevent utilities from receiving a windfall? Do the effects of a recession, will the effects of a recession be felt on electric usage?
if you have a recession and you have a decline in sales, that decline in sales would probably be reflected in a decoupling mechanism. However, in that kind of a situation, depending upon the kind of decoupling mechanism you have, you could go back in and readjust rates. If you have a decoupling mechanism that has many rate cases, or if you are using a stair step where you are predicting that recession and the impacts of that recession, you could account for that in your decoupling mechanism. So there are some tools with decoupling is not perfect in this regard, but depending upon the mechanism you use, you could help mitigate some of that. And recall that the hybrid method that we talked about at the beginning discussed using more than one revenue adjustment mechanism. So you can layer on a few to try to address that kind of a concern.
And Dave, one other thing to say about this is that in traditional regulation, in the event of a recession that causes a significant drop in sales, that would produce frequent rate cases during the extent of the recession, and we'd have similar results. I think the question really is, if we have a recession but there's no significant underlying change in utility costs, is there really a need to have a rate case just to solve for the revenue requirement that isn't really changing that much? Perhaps all we really need to be doing is adjusting rates higher, unfortunately, because of the effects of the recession, that we would do in a rate case if we had to, but we don't have to go through all that analysis in a rate case. The underlying costs aren't changing that much, if at all, and the utility still has the job that it needs to do and still has the needs for revenue that it has. None of that is creating a windfall for the utilities. We still want to have good service even if the economy is having a downturn.
Okay. Are there states that have introduced decarbonization requirements through decoupling? If so, where and how successful has that been?
I'm not aware of any. Are you, Rich?
Not explicitly, no. I mean, if you think that energy efficiency is, in a sense, a strategy that has an environmental component to it, then that's fine. But if what the questioner is asking about is some sort of performance standard for the power sector on carbon output, this isn't typical, although it is the sort of thing that some talk about that could be a part of a performance system which could be coupled with a decoupling mechanism, but it is typically not a part of decoupling, which is really a financial mechanism, and so these can be coincident, but it wouldn't be included normally.
Okay, thanks. Is there any evidence that decoupling allows utilities to get quote-unquote lazy a bit? Even if decoupling is conditioned on efficiency measures, how is this not viewed as helping the big rich utilities instead of forcing them to change with changing times, trends, and conditions?
Well, as we discussed earlier, utilities still have an incentive to be very efficient in their operations because the revenue requirements they get is what they get. And so if they want to increase earnings in any measure, then they have to be very efficient in their operations and they have to be paying attention to those kinds of things. I would argue that, if a utility is getting excess earnings, then maybe they're paying a little less attention to it because they're fat and happy. So the revenue requirements keep them within a certain discipline, and so I think it can be helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have heard this. It's part of the criticism that I've heard from large industrial customers that decoupling makes life easier on the utilities. And what I hear and have seen evidence of is utilities saying if we don't have to spend so much time on rate cases and so much time worrying about volume, we can actually spend more time worrying about service and worrying about what our customers want. And I think it is important for regulators to look for evidence of that, but uniformly that is the kind of response that I see from utilities is more customer responsiveness, not more inattentiveness.
Is the ability to provide more certainty for investors the only real benefit to utilities from decoupling? Are there other ways to design the decoupling mechanism that can help make utilities more supportive of decoupling?
Well, I think eliminating the throughput incentive is huge for utilities because it allows them to be assured that they're going to have their revenue requirements. And so I don't think we should underestimate the significance of that for them. And then, if you couple it with providing incentive mechanisms so that they perform well in energy efficiency or other factors, that can provide a further boon or incentive to utilities to act in a manner that is aligned with public policy objectives.
Let's be clear, as utilities that are not happy about decoupling tend to be not happy about it because they like the prospect of more sales throwing off profit margins which are not reflected in the rate case and which can flow to the bottom line, either to increase earnings or if that's not acceptable, then allow them more flexibility to spend. If a regulator should consider whether that's the case in their state. Certainly there have been some CEOs who have said very clearly that they're not interested in decoupling because they want to have the margins from increased sales which produce basically free cash flow that's not accounted for in the last rate case. And I think a utility has to reflect on whether those increased margins, first of all, are realistic at a time when load growth projections seem to be getting lower. And second of all, whether there's a risk associated with serving those increased sales. Capital construction is risky. Capital assets go over budget. Will PUCs always be there to allow for the recovery of capital assets that go over budget by significant amounts? There's risk associated with load growth, and some utilities have gotten around to saying, well, maybe this widows and orphans approach to our business is really the right one, and we should be getting earnings quality from our investments, reducing risk where we can, and decoupling can help the culture of our company accomplish that.
Thanks, Rich. There's a question about the decoupling calculation, the customer decoupling calculation. I believe that's slide 37. Why would you increase the target revenue number outside of a rate case simply because you've had growth in the number of customers? That revenue adjustment assumes that the revenues collected through the customer charge for those new customers aren't covering the fixed costs with no evidence to support the assumption. By increasing the total revenue needed, you're giving the utility a windfall. The target revenue number should remain the same in your example, in my view. The target revenue number should remain fixed until the next rate case where all cost/revenue streams can be examined. Have I misunderstood your recommendation?
Janine, are we still, if Janine's not there, I'll be happy to take that. This is a choice. There are some commissions who will say that our utility service territories are still building out, costs are driven by customer counts, and that the revenue per customer is an apt an apt proxy for talking about how costs are increasing over time. So this can be a useful way to, in years 2, 3, 4 of a decoupling mechanism, make sure that the revenue requirement is changing in the way that the target revenue requirement is changing associated with reality. But there are other circumstances, for example, a place where the system is largely already built out, where costs are not driven quite so much, or maybe not much at all, by customer counts. And in those situations, the revenue per customer approach would be inapt, and other ways to reflect changes in revenue requirement over the course of time is maybe more appropriate. I think the fundamental thing that is embedded in the question is whether the revenue requirement should change at all during the decoupling mechanism, and that's a fair question. If you adopt one approach to decoupling that I think is useful, which is that decoupling outcomes in terms of revenue requirement should reflect what frequent rate cases would have produced if they'd been done properly and well, and underlying costs are changing, then if the revenue requirement doesn't change during the course of the decoupling mechanism while underlying costs are in fact changing, then there will be instability and stress in the utility, and service can suffer, and access to capital can suffer, and I don't think anybody is suggesting that decoupling should cause a result like that. So where there is a likelihood of underlying costs changing during a decoupling period, some sort of attrition adjustment approach, which is basically a forecasted approach to rate making, can be accurate enough to reset the way that utilities work, the way rates are managed over a several year period, and be fair enough for everyone. And I think that's the idea here. If we could be confident that utilities could control costs, if you wanted to basically create a cost cap, that's certainly possible, but there are risks associated with having a multi-year cost cap, and that's one of the choices that the regulator and the designer of decoupling mechanism have to manage.
Thanks, Rich. Are there instances where decoupling's been approved, but only with the consumer-oriented design features that you've identified? Cap-on adjustments, tying approval to meaningful efficiency, program commitments, requirements to proportionally target EE funding to well-designed low-income programs, and at least retrospective review of return on equity based on altered utility risk profile?
Well, those kinds of features are typical. I think we talk about those in our case studies, but I think those kinds of features are typical, and I would encourage states that are new to decoupling, perhaps in their first cycle, to look carefully at how the mechanism is working, how it's performing, and for states that aren't doing decoupling now and considering it for the first time, to build those kinds of expectations into their plan. Some people say that there's less regulation associated with decoupling, and I would say it's different regulation. It's not less. I don't know if it's less or more, but it's certainly different. The kinds of things that this regulatory staff would be doing will be the sorts of things that the questioner is asking about, which is different from the routine that is typical in many states.
Do you believe that consumers should ask utilities to demonstrate a revenue stability or sufficiency before supporting decoupling?
Revenue stability or sufficiency, I think this depends on the circumstances that we're in. If you're a utility that's about to deploy an AMI system, it's going to be hard to say that costs aren't changing under a circumstance where they're deploying all these meters as well as a meter data management system. Likewise, we see some utilities in a situation with a lot of aging infrastructure that needs to be addressed, that needs to be replaced, or else there will be service problems. So these are all facts on the ground that the decoupling designers, the utilities, the commission, stakeholders will have in front of them, and it's why one would build in some reasonable expectations for how the revenue requirement needs to change over the course of a decoupling mechanism to reflect those realities. Perhaps at some point in the future we'll be in a situation where we've gotten through all of those high cost periods and we'll get into a declining cost situation. What we have trouble recognizing in decoupling are those costs that can be avoided. If we have distributed resources, efficiency, and others that are avoiding large capital costs, consumers never see those avoided costs. It's the old counterfactual problem. And so we see the costs that we see, but we can't see the costs that we avoid by having practices in place that will tend to avoid those costs.
Are there still instances where vertically integrated utilities have G and T and D decoupling but still may be averse to increasing energy efficiency offerings if those offerings harm the outlook for the utility's existing generation assets?
Definitely. In the U.S., there are definitely integrated companies that are staking their future on generation. And I think in those situations, it is hard to convince a utility in that situation that decoupling is helpful, because it's also hard to convince them that efficiency is a useful thing. So we have a full range, a full universe of a spectrum of utility types in the United States, some of which are fully invested in demand resources and some that really don't see them as important contributors.
Do you have a sense of what an optimal time for repeating a full base rate case would be?
Well, it varies depending on some of the underlying cost drivers. We tend to like to say 3 to 5 years. If a state is new to decoupling, it'll probably want to be on the 3-year end of that, just to make sure that things are okay. But with increased planning and sophistication, the length of times can get long, 5 years or even out beyond 5 years. So there's no rule of thumb on where the optimum level is, but I do think that letting decoupling run for a few years, 3 is a good number at the minimum, is helpful to start seeing changes in the way that the utility works. I think that's the key thing to look for in the states that have decoupling is how they start not focusing so much on throughput and focusing more on service. and that takes time to make those changes in the way a utility works.
Is there a benefit cost test to determine if a utility should or shouldn't engage in decoupling?
I've never seen a successful effort at doing this. This is something that does come up in the conversation frequently, and I've never been able to see this. And part of it is the challenge of creating the compared to what, the counterfactual for what would happen without decoupling. And there are also some significant hard to quantify aspects like the attention of the management team to service, which tends to go up, but exactly what does that, how do you quantify that in a benefit cost? So I've never seen a successful effort to do that. I think you either decide that the alignment is working for you today with traditional regulation, or you decide that the alignment under decoupling would be better.
What are the benefits of decoupling over lost revenue adjustment mechanisms that only adjust when there's, for example, energy efficiency improvements?
I think it's important for utilities to not be worried about sales. And we sometimes refer to the difference between utilities which are affected with the public interest and any other private sector businesses which are just there for their shareholders. Utilities have this dual role of being there for their shareholders, but also supporting an important public interest that keeps our economies and our lifestyles going. So we want to see that the utility behaviors are going to be positive in reflecting the public interest, and so well, I'll just stop there. Let some more questions come.
Okay. Many corporations are seeking direct access to renewables provided through their utilities. These corporations wish to also have the fuel cost certainty pass through to them. How does decoupling support or complicate utilities being able to offer these renewable product opportunities to corporations in relation to their more conventional service?
Well, this is one reason why focusing on the delivery side of the business for decoupling may be the right approach, and that the volatility associated with generation is difficult for decoupling mechanisms to manage. We have a lot of sources of disruption in the utility business, from customer resources generally to consumer choice aggregation in several states to these industrial and large customer buy-throughs. The commodity part of the business is managed through riders in a pretty effective way, and but the wires part of the business is still needed to deliver services to CCA communities, to industrial buy-throughs, to customers who are making choices to produce their own resources. There's still delivery needed for all of those, and so it's, I think, useful to consider focusing decoupling on those fundamental monopoly activities.
Do you agree with the statement, Rich, that decoupling takes care of short-term revenue needs but limits the inclination for future investment?
Well, I think this gets to the degree to which decoupling changes the culture of the utility in ways that are not driving it to increase sales. Investment in generation and transmission associated with increased sales, which can be risky, as I mentioned before, and may not be ultimately the best path for society if customer resources would be better. Decoupling can put the utility in a position of saying, how can we enable the right thing to happen and not worry quite so much about how sales growth works. But as I also said before, if we have a return on equity for capital assets, but for expenses that the utility incurs to support customers doing what they want to do, and that doesn't produce a return, and those are essentially substitutes, economic substitutes, that creates a different problem for the regulator to consider. Decoupling is useful, but it doesn't fully solve this capital bias issue, and regulators may have to go into considering ways to offer some returns, as California has just done in the last few months with an order allowing for a 4% return on some utility expenses that support customer resources. This kind of approach is pretty creative. It's an experiment. We'll see how it works, but it addresses the issue and demonstrates how decoupling, which California also has, is useful, supportive, but not sufficient necessarily to fully solve this kind of problem.
Okay, Rich, last question. Decoupling is not new. It's been around for years. Have you witnessed any cases where decoupling was adopted but then later returned to recoupling? And if so, what were the drivers in those situations?
Well, I think there are some examples of that. I think if we have people from Wisconsin on the webinar, they will recognize themselves in that question. And I think what was happening there was a lot of underlying cost increases that people on the ground felt needed to have frequent rate cases. And with frequent rate cases, the efficacy of a decoupling mechanism was diminished. They didn't need decoupling if they were going to have a rate case every year. And my observation is that those situations are really the exception in the U.S. In most places, costs aren't changing that fast or that much, and that in situations where decoupling can help regulation be more efficient, in more typical situations, it's likely to be effective. But yes, there have been cases for that, and it's certainly important for regulators to keep their hand on the tiller and to do what makes sense at any given time. But I will say that if Wall Street becomes comfortable that a state is committed to decoupling, the risk aspects of decoupling can be fully realized, and if the sources of capital are not sure that decoupling is a commitment for the state, then there may be a cost in the cost of capital to that state, and that's something that regulators would want to keep in mind.
Great. Well, thanks, Rich. Thanks for this entire 90 minutes here. We've reached sort of the end of the extended time here, the extended 30 minutes. Thanks to those of you, about 50 of you, who stayed on till the very end here. I hope you enjoyed this. Remember, if you can just take a couple minutes to fill out the survey at the end of this, be very helpful to us, and also that this will be posted if you want to share a link with somebody else in the future. Again, thanks, Rich, and thanks to you all for joining us. I think we've completed the webinar.